Dorothy Calloway pressed her back against the wall of the feed store and watched a grown man cry. Not quietly, not with dignity. Hector Brand stood in the middle of Caldwell Crossing's Saturday market with his hat in both hands and his jaw working and his eyes bright with the particular desperation of a man who has asked everyone and been told no by all of them, and now he was asking her. A woman he had never spoken to. A woman this town had spent 2 years deciding wasn't worth speaking to at all. "Please," he said. "My boy hasn't said a word in 18 months, not one. I'll pay whatever you ask. I'll give you whatever I have. Just please." Dot looked at him. Then she looked past him at the small figure standing perfectly still beside the wagon. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't frightened. He was just gone somewhere behind his eyes, and the look on his face was one Dot recognized, all the way down to the marrow of her bones. She had worn that same look once, after the baby, after Thomas. After the mine took everything and left her with nothing but grit and 2 jars of preserved peaches and 4 days left on a room she could no longer pay for. She picked up her basket. "My dog comes with me," she said. If this story already has your heart, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Caldwell Crossing, Wyoming Territory, 1883, and find out what happens when the last woman anyone would choose becomes the only one with the courage to stay. The morning had not been kind to Dorothy Calloway, but then most mornings weren't, and she had long since stopped expecting otherwise. She had been at the Caldwell Crossing Saturday market since 6:30, which meant she had been standing on her feet in the October cold for going on 3 hours, and in that time she had sold exactly nothing. The 2 jars of apple preserves she'd spent 4 days making sat on the edge of the feed store's front step, where she'd arranged them with care labels, facing out lids wiped clean. Beside them, her small bundle of dried sage from the patch behind the boarding house. Beside that, the mending she'd taken in for Mrs. Alderman, finished and folded and never claimed. Grit lay across her boots and radiated warmth upward, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for Dot Calloway in recent memory. "Move along," said the man from the grain cellar, not for the first time. He had a wide red face and the kind of authority that came from owning property and knowing everyone else knew it. "This isn't a dedicated space. You're blocking foot traffic." "I'm not blocking anything," Dot said. Her voice came out level. She had a gift for level born of long practice. "I'm standing against a wall." "You take up considerable wall." He looked her up and down the way people in this town looked at her, slow and deliberate, and entirely without shame, because shame required believing the other person had feelings worth accounting for. "Move along, or I'll speak to the market committee." Dot picked up her 2 jars, and her sage, and her folded mending, and moved 6 feet to the left. Grit followed, nails clicking on the packed dirt ears back, watching the grain cellar man with an expression of quiet professional contempt. "Good girl," Dot said quietly. She was rearranging her jars against the fence post when she heard the raised voice. She didn't look up immediately. Raised voices at the Saturday market were not uncommon, and they rarely concerned her. Then she heard the word boy, and then she heard the particular quality of silence that followed it, a held breath quiet, and she looked. There was a child standing at the edge of the crowd near the wagon row. 9 years old maybe, small for it, or just made small by whatever he was carrying. Dark eyes, dark hair, a wool coat buttoned straight to the collar by someone who still bothered. He was standing completely still in the middle of the foot traffic while everyone moved around him, not lost, not looking for anyone. Just still the way Dot had seen animals go, still in the field when the world got too loud, and the only available response was to stop moving and wait for it to pass. 2 boys had found him. They were 11, maybe 12, old enough to know better, and young enough to believe that didn't apply to them. One of them was doing something with his face, jaw, slack eyes, empty tongue, working at nothing. imitating absence, imitating the inside of a head he'd decided had nothing in it. The other one was bent double laughing. The small boy did not react. His chest rose and fell, in shallow, careful increments, the breathing of someone who had learned to make themselves as little as possible, and hold still and wait for it to end. Dot knew that breathing. She had learned it from her husband Thomas, who had come back from 3 years underground in the Nevada silver mines with something broken inside him that no doctor had a name for. 6 years she had sat with that breathing, learned what it meant and what it cost, and what the worst thing you could do was when someone was inside it. She set her jars down on the fence post and walked over. She was not a small woman. She was a large woman, a heavy woman, the kind of woman who took up space in a way that made certain people uncomfortable, and she had spent years learning to move apologetically to manage that discomfort for them. She did not move apologetically now. She moved the way she moved when something needed doing, and she was the one available to do it. The two boys saw her coming, and the laughter died in their throats. Not because she was threatening, because there was something in her steadiness that was worse than a threat. She didn't look at them. She looked only at the small boy, and she went down onto one knee in the dirt coat spreading out around her and put herself at his level. "Morning," she said. "You can ignore whoever isn't worth your time. I've been doing it all morning myself, and I find it works pretty well." The boy's eyes moved to her face. Slow, deliberate, the way you looked at something when you genuinely wanted to understand it. He looked at her the way he had not looked at the two boys, the way you looked at something that surprised you by being real. Then his eyes dropped to Grit, who had settled beside Dot's knee and was looking up at the boy with ears forward and tail making one slow sweep. Something moved at the corner of the boy's mouth. Not a smile. The memory of the shape one made. The two boys drifted sideways and were gone, and Dot didn't watch them go. "Her name's Grit," Dot said. "She's particular about who she likes. You'd be doing her a favor if you let her say hello." The boy looked at the dog. His hand came up very slowly, the way you reached for something you'd been wanting for a long time, but had stopped believing you were allowed to want. His fingers found the top of Grit's head. Grit's tail moved twice, then twice more. "Dorothy Calloway," a voice said behind her, sharp and prepared. "What do you think you're doing?" Dot straightened and turned. Miriam Good stood with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, and her expression already assembled, the look of a woman who had formed her conclusion before she arrived and was here solely to deliver it. She was the wife of Franklin Good, who sat on the town council and had opinions about everything and the political influence to make those opinions consequential. Miriam had inherited his confidence without his position, which made her meaner with it. Her eyes traveled down the length of Dot and back up, said everything they intended without a single word attached. "This child is not your concern," Miriam said. She had a carrying voice, the kind trained for audiences. The people nearby had already begun to slow and stop. "And frankly, given your situation, you'd do well to concern yourself with your own affairs before inserting yourself into those of others." Dot looked at her steadily, did not speak. "We all know what Dr. Harlan said about this boy." Miriam's voice rose slightly, finding its range now that it had listeners. 18 months of silence. Complete withdrawal from normal social interaction. The doctor's recommendation was clear. There is a facility in Cheyenne specifically designed for children like him, and the only reason he isn't there yet is his father's stubborn refusal to accept the professional consensus. She looked at the boy, then at Dot, with the expression of a woman delivering a regrettable truth. The last thing this child needs is strangers pushing themselves into a situation they don't have the training or the standing to address. The market had gone quiet around them, the way markets went quiet when something more interesting than commerce was happening. Dot looked past Miriam to the boy. He had not moved. His hand had gone still on Grit's head. His breathing had changed back careful, shallow, the breath of someone waiting for it to be over. She kept her eyes on him and said nothing to Miriam at all. "Mrs. Good." The voice arrived from behind the crowd, and people stepped aside for it, the way people stepped aside for men who had learned not to need them to. Hector Brand came through the crowd at the particular pace of a man who had made a decision 10 seconds ago and was in the process of acting on it. He was tall, lean, somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair going to gray at the temples, and a face that had been carrying something heavy for long enough that it had started to look like the face itself. He stopped beside his son and looked at Miriam Good with an expression that had no anger in it, which was somehow more final than anger would have been. "My son is not a topic for the Saturday market," he said quietly. "He is not a case study. He is not evidence for anyone's position. He is my son, and he is standing right here, and he can hear everything you've said." Miriam pressed her lips together. "Hector, I understand this is difficult, but Dr. Harlan has been very clear that—" "Dr. Harlan examined Miles for 40 minutes, Hector said. 40 minutes. I've been his father for 9 years. I know what my son needs, Mrs. Good, and I know what he doesn't, and I would appreciate it if you'd let me make that determination without your assistance." He looked at Dot then. He looked at her the way his son had looked at her directly, actually, like he was seeing her rather than deciding in advance what was there to see. She was aware in that moment of how she must look. Large, plain, poorly dressed, standing in the dirt with 2 jars of apple preserves and a yellow dog, and no visible claim on anyone's attention or respect. She was aware of all of it, had been aware of it since before she could name it, and she waited for the look to shift the way. Looks like that always shifted. It did not shift. "I've been watching for the last 5 minutes, Hector said. "I've been asking people in this town for a year and a half for someone who understands that my son's silence isn't a deficiency, that there's someone behind it." He stopped. His jaw worked once. "You knelt down in the dirt and talked to him like he was worth talking to. I have not seen one other person in this town do that in 18 months. He took his hat off and held it against his chest. It was the gesture of a man who had run out of pride and was operating on something more honest. "I need help," he said. "I need someone who can sit with a child who doesn't answer, who won't decide he's broken because he doesn't respond the way people expect. I have a relay station 6 miles out, room and board and a fair wage." A pause. "Can you talk to a boy who's never answered?" Dot looked at Miles. The boy was watching Grit with the focused patience of someone who had learned to want things without letting the wanting show. Grit had laid her chin on his knee. There was a man behind Dot in the market lane talking to someone she couldn't see, and through the canvas of it she heard the particular tone she had been hearing all morning. "Look at her, imagine. What exactly does he think she's going to do? A woman like that." She did not turn around. "My dog comes with me," Dot said. Something moved in Hector Brand's face. Not a smile, he was too tired for smiles, but a loosening of something that had been held tight for a very long time. "The station has mice," he said. "Consider her professional staff." Dot picked up her 2 jars of preserves, and her sage, and her folded mending, and placed them in her basket. She had 4 days left on her room at Ruth Sable's boarding house, and 17 cents in her coat pocket, and no other offers of any kind. She looked at Miles Brand one more time. He was still looking at Grit. His hand was moving slowly along the dog's back, careful and deliberate, the touch of a child who had learned to be very gentle with things he was afraid of losing. She understood that completely. She turned toward the wagon. Miles fell into step beside his father without being told. Grit walked beside Miles. Dot walked beside Grit, and she moved as if this were something she had chosen freely, as if it were not the last door standing open in a hallway that had been going dark for months, as if she were not grateful down to the bottom of her bones that it had opened at all. She did not look back at the market. She did not look at the 2 women near the dry goods stand who had stopped talking when the brand wagon passed. She did not look at Miriam Good, who was still standing in the same spot with her arms still crossed. She looked at the road ahead and kept her face easy. The brand relay station sat at the end of 6 miles of High Plains Road, and they made it in near silence, which suited Dot fine. Hector drove. Miles sat between them on the bench seat, not pressed against her, not leaning away, just present, watching the road the way children watch things they weren't sure about but weren't ready to leave. Once Grit put her head in Miles's lap from the wagon bed, and he let her. Hector glanced sideways at that, and then back at the road, and said nothing. The station came into view at the bottom of a long slope, main building stable, fence-lined smokehouse, a water trough needing repair. The kind of place that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and maintained by someone who no longer had the heart for it. Dot saw it in the fence posts first, one leaning, one missing a crossbar replaced with rope. The rope recently knotted, not recently replaced. The garden to the east side of the house laid out correctly, planted correctly, and then left to the weeds 3/4 through. Someone had started caring for this place and then stopped. Hector brought the wagon to a halt and set the brake and climbed down without ceremony. He lifted Miles down without being asked and set him on his feet, and Miles went directly into the house without looking back. Hector stood by the wagon. "It's not much," he said. "I've seen less," Dot said. She climbed down herself. Not gracefully. The wagon step was built for a different set of proportions, and Hector put a hand out. She took it because refusing it would have been its own kind of performance. She found the ground and released his hand and picked up her bag. "Thank you," she said. Just for the hand. Just for the matter-of-fact way it had been offered. Not pointed, not charitable. Just a hand where a hand was useful. He nodded, opened the front door. The house was clean, which told her something. The table was clear, and the floor was swept, and the dishes were stacked. But the chair nearest the window was pulled out from the table at an angle, and had not been pushed back in, not today, not yesterday, maybe not in weeks. A man's coat was folded over the stair rail in the particular way of something set down temporarily and never picked back up. A child's boot sat at the foot of the stairs. Only one, the other one presumably upstairs, and no one had thought to bring the first one up to join it. Nothing was dirty. Nothing was cared for. There was a difference. Miles was already gone into the back of the house. She could hear him on the floor, above the particular creak of boards that meant a child moving carefully, trying not to be heard. "The back room's made up," Hector said. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, hat back in his hands again. It was... He stopped, started differently. "It's been empty a while. There's a spare quilt in the chest." "Thank you," Dot said again. He looked at her for a moment like he was going to say something else. Then he put his hat on and went out the back to the stable, and the door settled shut behind him with the sound of a man retreating to somewhere he knew how to be. Dot set her bag on the kitchen table and stood for a moment in the quiet. Then she opened the first cupboard. Flour, half a sack. Salt nearly gone. 2 tins of beans, dried peas in a cloth bag. A small brown bottle of something medicinal she did not investigate. In the second cupboard, plates, 3 of them, and 2 cups, one with a hairline crack run up the side that someone had kept using anyway. She found the stove laid with wood, but unlit. She found matches in the tin on the windowsill. She lit the stove, filled the pot with water from the pump, and began. She did not ask permission. She did not make an announcement. The house needed warming, and she was in it, and she knew how, and those 3 facts together were sufficient authority. The creak upstairs had gone still. She was cutting the dried peas into the pot when she heard the first stair step. She did not turn around. She kept her hands at the work knife, steady eyes forward, the way she had learned to keep herself when Thomas was standing in a doorway, deciding whether to come in or go back. The kitchen door pushed open just slightly. She kept working. She heard the floor very quiet, and then the particular quality of silence that meant a person had settled into a spot and decided to stay in it. She did not turn around. She talked the way she had talked to Thomas on the bad evenings when looking at him directly was too much weight. "Dried peas take about an hour," she said to the pot to the stove, to no one in particular. "My mother always said the trick was the salt." You put it in too early, they go tough. Too late, they taste like nothing. She picked up the wooden spoon and stirred. She was right about most things except people. She was not always right about people. Silence behind her. "Grit," she said. "You can sit." She heard Grit's nails on the floor, and she heard a small, sharp breath that wasn't quite a sound, but was almost one, and she did not turn around. She kept her hands moving and her voice low, and the kitchen warm, and she did not make it into anything more than what it was. Outside, the October light was going down over the high plains in long gold sheets, and the relay station at Caldwell Crossing, which had been a place people passed through for a year and a half without anyone stopping, had a fire lit in the kitchen for the first time in longer than Dot would come to understand for several days yet. She did not know what the weeks ahead held. She did not know about the council meeting already scheduled, or the letter already being drafted, or the name Dr. Harlan had been asked to put in writing by Franklin Good 2 days before Dot Calloway ever set foot on this road. She knew the peas needed another 40 minutes. She knew there was a boy sitting on the kitchen floor behind her with his hand on her dog's back. She knew that hand had been very still for a long time, and then it had started moving. That was enough to work with. That was, in her experience, always enough to start. The first 3 days were not progress. Dot had not expected them to be. Miles Brand moved through the station the way water moved around a stone quietly, without confrontation, simply choosing a different path. Every room she entered, he vacated. Not rudely, not with any visible emotion attached to it. He simply gathered whatever he had been doing, his chalk, his paper. The particular worn horse blanket he carried from room to room, like a portable piece of ground he owned, and relocated to somewhere she wasn't. She let it happen. She did not follow. She did not adjust her movements to make it easier for him to avoid her either. She was simply present steadily, without apology, taking up the space she occupied, and not reducing it for anyone's comfort. Grit, however, had her own agenda entirely. By the second morning, Grit had transferred her primary loyalty to Miles Brand, with the serene decisiveness of an animal who had made an executive decision and saw no reason to discuss it. She slept outside his door. She appeared beside him at meals without being called. When Miles relocated to the back hallway with his chalk and paper, Grit went to the back hallway and settled herself across his feet and stayed there until he moved again. Miles allowed this. That was the word Dot used in her own mind aloud because it was accurate. He did not reach for Grit. He did not initiate contact. But when Grit placed herself against him, he did not move away, and after a while, his hand would find the top of her head with the slow, careful deliberateness of someone who had been wanting to do it for 10 minutes and was finally willing to admit it. Dot watched from doorways briefly, then moved on. She narrated her work sometimes, not to him, not to Hector, just into the room, the way she had done with Thomas, on the evenings when direct conversation was too much weight for him to carry. She talked about what she was cooking. She talked about the fence post she'd noticed leaning on the east side. She talked about Grit's habit of hurting small animals, even though there were none present, which she'd worked out was the dog's way of managing anxiety, and she found that sympathetic. She heard nothing back. She did not expect to. She was not fishing for response. She was simply filling the air with ordinary human sound so that silence was not the only available atmosphere in the house, and she kept her voice low and her tone level, and she moved on to the next task. On the third afternoon, she was mending a bridle at the kitchen table when she became aware that the hallway was occupied. She did not turn around. She kept her hands on the bridle needle, moving through the cracked leather steady and unhurried. The presence in the hallway did not move, did not make a sound. But it was there. She could feel it the way you felt weather coming, a change in the quality of the air. "Bridle leather goes brittle in cold weather," she said. "Cracks right through if you don't keep it worked. Your father's got 3 others in the stable that need attention, but I'll start with this one." She turned it in her hands, examining the stitching. "My husband Thomas used to say leather was honest. It told you exactly how it had been treated. You couldn't argue with leather." The hallway was quiet. "I respected that about it," she said. She heard a small sound. Not a word. Not even close to a word. Just a shift of weight, a foot moving on the floor, the sound of a child adjusting his position without leaving. She kept her eyes on the bridle. Hector Brand was a harder problem, and Dot was honest enough with herself to know it. He was not unkind. He was not cold. He was a man who had built a functional life on top of a grief he had never finished with, and functional was the ceiling he had set for himself, and she could see him managing constantly against the risk of exceeding it. He checked the station's 3 exterior doors every night before bed. He answered direct questions with direct answers. He fed his son and clothed his son and kept the station running with the mechanical competence of a man who had decided that doing the necessary things correctly was the closest available substitute for being all right. He had hired her because he was desperate, and she was present, and he was grateful, and he showed gratitude by staying out of her way and leaving her to the work, and she understood all of that and did not hold any of it against him. But sometimes, she caught him watching Miles with an expression she recognized, the look of a man standing on the outside of a window watching something warm that he could not figure out how to get back inside. One evening, he came into the kitchen while she was at the stove and poured himself coffee and stood against the far wall, not in her way, not demanding conversation, just in the room. "He used to talk all the time," Hector said. She kept her hands moving on the stove. "Before. He used to talk the way some kids can't stop." His voice was even, carefully even. "Drove me half out of my mind sometimes, all the questions. What's that bird? Why does Frost do that? Papa, if you dig straight down far enough, do you come out the other side?" A pause. "I told him to give it a rest once. He was going on about something on the way into town, and I was tired, and I told him to give it a rest." Dot said nothing. That was 6 weeks before Clara died. He looked at his coffee cup. "I think about that more than I should." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. He was not looking at her. His jaw was set in the way of a man who had said more than he planned to and was waiting to find out what it cost him. "You said it once," she said. He heard 1,000 other things before that. He looked up. "Children keep a more honest account than we do," she said. "He knows what he had with you. 6 weeks didn't erase it." He looked at her for a moment with something uncertain in his face, like a man being told something he wanted to believe and couldn't decide if the wanting disqualified it. Then he nodded, put his cup down, went back out to the stable. She turned back to the stove and let out a slow breath and kept working. The drawing appeared on the 5th day. She found it on the kitchen table in the morning before anyone else was down. A horse, detailed and careful, every line placed with intention. Not a child's scribble, a child's serious work, which was different. The horse had a particular marking on its nose, a dark patch the shape of a thumb, and she looked at it for a long time because she knew without being told that this was a specific horse, not invented, remembered. She did not comment on it to Miles. She did not hold it up or make it into something that required a response from him. She looked at it, set her coffee cup beside it with care, so as not to cover any of the drawing, and made the biscuits. When Miles came down, he did not look at the drawing, but he ate his biscuits facing the table where it sat, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. She left a small thing beside it when she finished her coffee. A smooth round stone from the yard, pale gray, slightly flat, the kind of stone that fit well in a palm. No note, no explanation. She went out to mend the leaning fence post. That evening the stone was gone from the table. She did not remark on it. The second drawing came 2 days later. Then a third, 2 days after that. Each one left before dawn on the kitchen table. Each one a horse, each one the same horse with the thumbprint marking. She left something small beside each one. A biscuit wrapped in cloth. A spool of blue thread, its color probably meaningless but bright. A feather she'd found at the fence-line barn owl, the primary kind with the soft edge for silent flight. After the 4th drawing, she found the stone from the first exchange sitting on the windowsill in the kitchen. He had placed it there deliberately, she was certain of it. In a specific spot where the morning light came through and made the gray of it go briefly silver. She left it exactly where it was. Hector noticed the drawings on the table one morning before they'd been cleared. He stood looking at them with the coffee pot still in his hand, and his face doing something complicated and private. "He hasn't drawn in months," he said. "He draws every day," Dot said. She was turning biscuits. "In the back hallway, he has a whole system papers stacked in order chalk sorted by color before he starts." Hector set the coffee pot down. "How do you know that—" "I've walked past the hallway," she said simply. He looked at the drawings a moment longer. Then he poured his coffee. "That horse," he said. "That's Dime. Clara's mare. She's still in the stable." Dot did not say anything. "He won't go near the stable," Hector said. "Since Clara, he hasn't been in there once." She thought about that while she plated the biscuits, turned it over carefully. A boy who drew the same horse every day and would not go to where the horse was, reaching for something and refusing it at the same time. She understood that particular geography well enough. "He'll go when he's ready," she said. Hector looked at her across the kitchen. "You sound sure about that." "I'm not sure about anything," she said. "But I've learned that you can't pull someone towards something they're not ready to face and expect it to go well. You can only stay close enough that when they're ready, they know the way isn't empty." He looked at her for a moment, then down at his coffee. Then he said, "Clara used to say something like that." The kitchen was quiet. "I'm sorry," Dot said. She meant it without complication. He nodded once and took his biscuit and went to work. The crash happened on the 9th day. She was reaching for the cast-iron skillet from the high shelf above the stove, and the handle slipped and it came down with the full percussive force of 12 pounds of iron on a wooden floor. The kind of sound that filled every corner of a room and bounced off every wall and left the air ringing. She spun around. Miles was in the kitchen doorway. He had been drifting closer for the last 10 minutes in the way he'd started to drift closer, not entering, not committing but present at the edges. The crash had caught him fully in the middle of that approach. He was locked, body completely still, not his usual stillness. Not the contained, careful stillness. He lived in something different. Rigid, hands flat against his thighs. Eyes gone, somewhere that was not this kitchen, not this morning, not anywhere she could reach. She had seen Thomas go to this place, a door slamming, a horse shying a dropped pan, and he would be gone behind his eyes, while his body stayed where it was unreachable, adrift in something with no geography she knew. The worst thing, the thing she had learned at great cost and at length, was to cross that space, to reach for him before the wave passed. She had done it once in the first year, taken Thomas by the shoulders, and said his name, and the sound that came out of him had been nothing she could describe, and she had held the memory of it like a scar for years after. She did not move toward Miles. She picked up the bowl of dried beans she had been meaning to sort since yesterday morning, and she sat down on the kitchen floor. Not beside him. Not across from him. On the floor with the bowl in her lap in the middle of the kitchen, equidistant from everything. She began sorting beans, good ones to the left side of the bowl, shriveled ones to the right. The sound of the beans was small and ordinary and constant. She did not speak. She sorted beans. 4 minutes passed. 7. The beans made their small sounds. Grit appeared from somewhere and lay down 2 feet from Dot's knee without being asked, and the 3 of them were on the floor together in the kitchen, and the only sound was the beans and the ordinary winter creak of the building settling. Hector came through the back door at the 12-minute mark. She heard him stop in the doorway, heard him take in the scene, without speaking, the fallen skillet still on the floor where it had landed. Miles rigid in the doorway, Dot on the floor with her beans. He did not intervene. He did not speak. He stood in the back doorway and was still, and she did not look at him, but she was grateful for it, the exact quality of his restraint, the fact that he read the room and trusted it. At 17 minutes, Miles blinked. His hands loosened against his thighs. A long exhale moved through him, slow and deep, the breath of a man surfacing from deep water. He blinked again. His eyes came back to the kitchen, to the bowl, to Dot on the floor. She looked up at him from where she sat. "I've got too many beans for one person," she said. "You'd be doing me a favor." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went upstairs. His boots on the steps were slow and deliberate, the steps of someone reorienting themselves to the geography of solid ground. Hector came fully into the kitchen and stood against the far wall. "How did you know to do that?" he said. She put a handful of beans into the bowl. "My husband came back from the mines carrying something heavy. The world got too loud for him in ways other people couldn't hear. Certain sounds, certain sudden things, and he'd go somewhere I couldn't follow." She set the bowl on the table and stood up, knees protesting the floor. "I learned the hard way that the only thing you could do was stay close and stay ordinary and wait for him to find his way back." Hector was quiet for a moment. "I always reached for him," he said. His voice was low. He was not talking about Thomas. "When he'd lock up like that, I'd try to pull him back. Say his name, put my hand on his shoulder." Dot looked at him. He was looking at the table. "I thought I was helping," he said. She did not fill the silence that followed. She received what was in it, set it carefully aside, and let it be what it was. A quarter-hour later, Miles came back downstairs. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from the bowl of beans without being asked. He reached in, picked up a handful, and began sorting. Good ones left shriveled ones, right the same division she had been using. She stood at the stove and kept her back mostly to him, and kept talking about nothing in particular, the fence post she'd finished, the barn owl she suspected was nesting in the east corner of the stable roof, the way the weather was sitting on the mountains to the north like it was making a decision. Miles sorted beans. Grit lay across his feet. Outside, the Wyoming sky was pressing down hard and gray, and the temperature was dropping towards something serious, and inside the brand relay station, a woman who had been told all her life that she did not fit sat at a kitchen table with a silent boy and listened to the sound of beans, and let it be for this moment enough. The beans became a language of their own. After that afternoon on the kitchen floor, Miles began appearing at the table during the work hours with a reliability that Dot did not comment on and did not take for granted. He did not ask for tasks. He simply arrived and watched what her hands were doing, and after a few minutes began doing the same thing. Sorting. Folding. Stacking wood into the box beside the stove in the particular alternating pattern she used to keep the pile from tipping. He never looked directly at her when he did these things. He watched her hands, or he watched the task itself, or he watched Grit in the corner. But he was there, and he stayed, and that was the whole of what mattered. Hector noticed. She could see him noticing from the stable doorway in the mornings that particular stillness of a man watching something he'd been afraid to hope for. He didn't say much about it. He was not a man who said much about anything that mattered to him. She was learning as if the words themselves were a risk, as if naming a thing too directly might alter it or remove it. He expressed what he felt through small actions instead, and she was learning to read those the way she had learned to read Thomas, through what got fixed and what got left, what moved and what stayed still. The kitchen chair that had been wobbling since she arrived was solid under her one morning without explanation. The water pump handle that had been sticking got freed. A new crossbar appeared on the east fence post she'd repaired straight and well set, the work of someone who had looked at her repair and quietly improved it without saying a word about it. She said nothing about any of it either. Some exchanges didn't require words to be complete. The drawings on the table changed. On the 14th morning, she found not a horse, but a dog. Grit, unmistakable, the one cocked ear and the slightly too long legs rendered with real attention. The same serious, careful line quality as the horses, but pointed at something new, and under the dog in the bottom corner of the paper so small, she almost missed it, a hand. Just a hand. The lower portion of a sleeve, and a hand reaching toward the dog's head. She looked at that hand for a long time. She left a new piece of chalk beside it. Dark blue, the good kind, not the crumbling pale stuff from the general store. She had found it at the bottom of her bag from months ago, saved from some previous intention she no longer remembered, and she had been holding on to it without knowing why. She thought she knew why now. The afternoon she rode into Caldwell Crossing for supplies was cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming cold that came in off the high ground and found every gap in a coat. Hector had offered to go himself, but she had a list, and she knew what she needed, and it was faster when she knew. So she took the smaller wagon and made the 6 miles in just under an hour and tied up at the general store. Henderson, who ran the store, was a compact man with a gray beard and the careful neutrality of someone who depended on the goodwill of a town that held a variety of opinions. He greeted her without warmth and without hostility, which she had come to understand was his version of decency, and she worked through her list efficiently, and he filled the order without comment. She was tallying the flour when she heard Miriam Good's voice from the back of the store. She did not turn around. Still at the brand station. Miriam was speaking to someone loudly enough to not require an effort to be heard across the room. 3 weeks now. I suppose a woman in her position takes what she can secure, though one does have to wonder precisely what it is Hector Brand requires, from a woman of that particular type, that he couldn't arrange more sensibly otherwise. The other woman in the conversation did not respond audibly. The silence she returned had the quality of mild discomfort, rather than disagreement, which was its own answer. "And that boy," Miriam continued. "I spoke to Dr. Harlan just this past Tuesday. He is more certain than ever about his recommendation. A facility with trained professionals is what that child needs, not a well." A pause waited with its own punctuation. "Not whatever it is she imagines herself to be doing out there." Dot counted her flour and kept her back straight and her hands on the counter and her face pointed at the wall in front of her. Henderson added a tin of baking powder to her order that she had not asked for and had not yet put on her list. He set it on the counter with a brief businesslike tap and said nothing. She looked at it, then at him. He was already writing in his ledger. She paid for everything, including the baking powder, and carried the boxes out to the wagon herself, and she sat on the wagon bench for a long moment before she picked up the reins. The street was ordinary around her. A dog sleeping under the porch rail of the saloon. 2 men in front of the land office talking about water rights. A woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window. Nobody looking at her. Nobody needing to. She picked up the reins and headed back. The letter from the Caldwell Crossing Town Council arrived on a Thursday. She knew something had come before Hector said a word. He came in from the road with the particular set to his shoulders of a man who has received information he hasn't finished processing yet, and he sat at the kitchen table and read the paper in his hands twice, and then folded it and sat with it. Miles was in the hallway. Dot was at the stove. "Franklin Good filed a formal petition," Hector said. "Town council. He's calling what you're doing a form of unlicensed medical intervention on a minor." He set the paper flat on the table. "They've scheduled an assessment. 30 days from Thursday. A county examiner comes out, evaluates. Miles evaluates the situation." He stopped. "If the examiner decides the environment isn't in Miles's best interest, they have the authority to implement Harlan's facility recommendation." Dot turned from the stove and looked at him. 30 days, she said. "Yes." She looked at the paper on the table without touching it. She could see the official heading from where she stood, the formal blockwork of a document that had been prepared with care, the kind of document that meant someone had been building toward it for longer than 30 days. "What do you want to do?" she said. He looked up at her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name yet. "I want to tell Franklin Good what he can do with his petition," he said. "But wanting and doing are different things when a county examiner is involved." "Miles has made progress," she said. "Real progress. The drawings, the table. He sorted 2 bowls of beans last week and stayed in the kitchen for 90 minutes. He hasn't locked up from a sudden sound since the skillet." "I know that." "Then 30 days is enough time." He looked at her for a moment, with something uncertain moving behind his eyes. He opened his mouth and closed it again, and picked up his coffee, and she could see him arranging something internally. some response or objection or fear that he was deciding not to put into words. "Yes," he said finally. "You're right." He folded the letter and took it to the small desk in the back room, and she heard the drawer open and close, and then his boots on the floor going out to the stable, and she turned back to the stove and thought about the way he had looked at her in that moment, before he agreed, and she could not quite read what had been in it. She found the wall 3 days later. She had gone into Miles's room in the morning while he was in the stable, his absence making a kind of permission to change the bedding. She stepped through the door and stopped. Every inch of the east wall was covered. Not scribbled, not chaotic. Sequential. A careful, continuous narrative running from left to right, chalked directly on the plaster in the blue-gray tones of whatever he'd had available, and here and there, the dark blue of the chalk she had left him. She stood in the doorway and read it the way she read left to right, slowly following the sequence. A woman, drawn over and over across the top section, the same face from different angles and distances, a child's best effort at a face he was afraid of forgetting. Softer in the later drawings, the way remembered faces went soft with time and distance. The eyes especially. Clara. A bedroom. A woman in a bed. A small boy beside it, his mouth open. He was singing. There was no sound in any of the drawings, there never could be, but the open mouth, and the woman's eyes turned toward him, and her hand in his, told the story more plainly than any sound could have. Then the bed empty. Then the boy alone. Then a series of horses. Dime over and over the thumbprint marking the particular way she held her head. Then something new at the far right edge of the sequence, the most recent work by the freshness of the chalk. A kitchen. A stove. A woman's back wide-shouldered, a braid, a particular way of standing. The same hand from the drawing on the kitchen table reaching, but this time not toward a dog. Toward a boy sitting on a kitchen floor. Dot stood in front of that last image for a long time. She went to Hector that evening after Miles was upstairs. She found him at the desk in the back room with the ledger, and she stood in the doorway. "He has been talking this whole time," she said. "Everything he cannot say is on that wall." Hector looked up. "Have you seen it?" she said. A pause that lasted a breath too long before he answered. "I know it's there." "When did you last look at it?" He set his pen down. His jaw worked once. "A while ago." She waited. "I can't," he said. It came out flat and factual, which was worse than if it had come out broken. "I look at it, and I see Clara, and I see what he's been carrying alone for 18 months, and I—" He stopped, picked up the pen, set it down again. "I can't look at it and be useful afterward, so I stopped looking." She stayed in the doorway and said nothing. "That's a failing," he said, not to her, to the ledger, to the desktop, to whoever was keeping his accounting. "It's human," she said. "Same thing sometimes." She looked at him for a moment at the back of his neck, bent over the desk at the set of his shoulders, at the way he was holding the pen he wasn't using. "He drew the kitchen," she said. "He drew me at the stove. He drew a hand reaching toward him." She let that sit for a second. "He's not just recording what's gone, Hector. He's recording what's arriving." Hector was very still. "Go look at the wall," she said. "When you're ready. Don't wait until you're sure you can stand it. You can't always wait for that." She went back to the kitchen and washed the supper dishes and heard him on the stairs 20 minutes later, slow and deliberate, going up. She did not go up. She stayed in the kitchen and let the sound of the water cover whatever else there was to hear. He came down after half an hour and went directly out to the stable without coming through the kitchen, and she understood and did not follow. What she did not see, what she had no way of knowing, was that Miles had not been asleep. Miles had heard his father's footsteps in the hall, had heard them stop outside the door, had heard the door open. He had kept his eyes closed and his breathing even, and listened to his father stand in that room for a long time, and at some point he had heard a sound he had not heard from his father in 18 months. Barely a sound, quickly controlled a man who had decided a long time ago that certain kinds of grief were private. Miles lay still in his bed and held that sound inside him like something he did not yet know what to do with. The next morning, Hector was already at the table when Dot came down. His coffee was half gone, which meant he'd been there a while. Miles came down 20 minutes later, which was earlier than usual. He went to his chair. He looked at his father for a moment, a direct look, the kind Miles rarely gave anyone. Then he reached into the pocket of his trousers and took out the smooth gray stone from the windowsill. The first one Dot had ever left beside his drawing, and he set it on the table in front of his father. Hector looked at the stone. Then he looked at his son. Miles looked back at him with the serious, unguarded directness of a child who has decided that something matters enough to make himself available to it. Hector picked up the stone, turned it in his palm once, set it back down but kept his hand around it. He did not speak. Miles did not speak. Dot turned back to the stove and kept her hands busy and did not intrude on what was happening behind her. It was not a resolution. It was not a reconciliation. It was a stone placed on a table by a boy who had no words yet, and a man who had too many he couldn't use, and it was the first direct thing that had passed between them in longer than either could have said, and it was enough. It was everything, and it was only the beginning, and Dot knew without turning around that the 30 days ahead would require everything she had. The distance she had not named yet was already there. She had not seen it clearly until that evening when she went to the porch at the usual hour and Hector was not there. She sat alone and watched the cold Wyoming light go flat and gray over the high ground to the west, and told herself it meant nothing. A busy man. A working station in the weeks before hard winter. She went inside and heard him moving through the back of the house, and he did not come through the kitchen the way he had started coming through the kitchen, and she kept her back to the doorway, and her hands on the dishes, and her face easy. When the world decided to withdraw, the only dignified response was not to chase it. She had learned that too from Thomas, from the market, from every room she had ever walked into, and felt the temperature drop at the sight of her. She dried the last dish and set it in the cupboard and looked at the wall above the stove where nothing hung. 30 days. Franklin Good's letter in the desk drawer. Dr. Harlan's name on the official heading. The county examiner on a date 3 weeks and some days ahead. Miles had sorted beans. Miles had placed a stone. Miles had drawn a woman at a stove, and a hand reaching, and still she could feel the ground shifting under the whole of it. Could feel the way the letter had changed the quality of the air in the house in ways that Miles had not yet learned to name, but that his body was already reading. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and looked at nothing. She thought about what Miriam Good had said in the general store, the easy certainty of it, and about the 30-day letter, and about the way Hector had looked at her across the kitchen when she said 30 days was enough, that uncertain thing moving behind his eyes that she hadn't been able to read. She was beginning to think she could read it now. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and listened to the Wyoming wind work at the station's north wall, and she thought about what it meant to be useful to people, and what it meant to become a problem for them, and where the line between those two things ran, and whether she had already crossed it without knowing. Outside the window the cold was serious, and getting more so, and somewhere in the stable, a mare with a thumbprint marking stood in her stall, and a boy upstairs had not yet found the courage to go to her, and a man was sleeping 3 rooms away with a stone on the table beside his coffee cup. Dot put her hand over her eyes and held it there until the shaking in her chest settled. Then she took her hand away and looked at the ceiling and made herself breathe slow, even the way she had taught herself to breathe when the ground went uncertain, and the only available option was to stay standing on it. The distance had a texture now. She could feel it the way you felt a change in weather before it arrived. Something in the air pressure, something in the quality of the light. Hector was present at every meal, answered every practical question, kept the station running with the same mechanical competence she had come to know. But the warmth that had been building between them over weeks, the porch at the same hour, the way he had started coming through the kitchen. Not because he needed anything from the kitchen, but simply to be in the same room. the almost smiles, the almost conversations, all of it had acquired a careful quality. Correct distance. The distance of a man who had made a private decision and was managing the implementation of it. She tried once. She came out to the stable one afternoon where he was working the bridle leather she'd identified as the worst of the three, doing it correctly. She noticed the way she had shown him. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold. "You seem far away lately," she said. He kept his hands moving on the leather. "Been a lot on. North pasture fencing before the snow comes in. Station accounts are behind." "All right," she said. She stood there for a moment longer, giving him space to add to it, to redirect it, to give her anything that was actually true. He did not. His hands moved on the leather, and his eyes stayed on the work. She went back inside. That night she sat at the kitchen table after the house was fully dark and quiet, and she laid it out for herself the way she laid out hard things, honestly, without the mercy of softening. The town council letter was 3 weeks old now, a week remaining until the county examiner arrived. Franklin Good had used words like unlicensed and intervention and welfare concern in an official document, and those words had teeth. And Hector Brand was a practical man who had spent 1.5 years fighting for his son, and who understood better than most how quickly official documents with teeth could turn a situation permanent. She thought about Dr. Harlan's name on that letter and the facility in Cheyenne, and what it meant that someone had gone to the formal trouble of building a legal case while she was 6 miles out at a relay station sorting beans with a boy who didn't speak. She thought about Miriam Good's voice in the general store. A woman of that particular type. The particular type being large, being poor, being nobody, being the sort of woman a town decided about before she finished walking through the door. She thought about the porch at 5 o'clock, empty 4 evenings running now. She thought about Hector's face across the kitchen when she'd said 30 days was enough, and she finally named what she had seen moving behind his eyes in that moment. It was not uncertainty about her methods. It was a man calculating forward, running the numbers on what the examiner would see when he arrived, a woman with no qualifications, no standing, no name that meant anything in Caldwell Crossing or anywhere else, living under the same roof as a minor in a situation that Franklin Good had already successfully framed as a welfare concern. She was not angry. She understood it. A father protecting his son was the most comprehensible thing in the world, and Hector Brand had already lost enough that she could not find it in herself to fault him for not wanting to risk the rest. But understanding it and being able to stay inside it were different things. She sat at the table and thought about what it meant to become a ceiling instead of a door. To be the thing standing between Miles and the next step, rather than the thing that had made the next step possible. She thought about the examiner arriving and looking at this house and looking at her and writing something down in the official column that could not be undone. She thought about Miles in the stable that afternoon. He had gone in for the first time she had seen him from the kitchen window, just standing inside the door, with the light falling across his boots, not going to Dime's stall, not going anywhere, just standing in the place he had not been able to stand for 18 months. She had turned away from the window before he could look up and see her watching. She had protected that moment the way you protected something that shattered if you looked at it directly. He had gone in. That was the thing. He had gone in on his own. He did not need her to take him there. He had never needed her to take him anywhere. He had needed someone to stay close enough and quietly enough that the path didn't feel empty, and she had done that, and he was walking it now. The most loving thing available she thought might be to leave cleanly before the examiner made it a removal. She sat with that for a long time. Beneath all the careful reasoning. If she was honest, and she required honesty of herself, the way she required clean water beneath the logic about ceilings and doors and county examiners and Hector's calculated distance, there was a simpler thing she would not say aloud, even to herself. The porch at 5 o'clock. The way he had placed her hands on the cinch when she was learning the saddle, his voice quiet at her shoulder, the fraction of a second longer than necessary before he stepped back. The evening he had said her name once with nothing attached to it except everything, and she had turned, and he had said same time tomorrow. and she had said same time tomorrow, and they had been. She was not going to stay in a place where a door was closing on her. She had enough self-regard left for that. Barely, but enough. She made her decision at the kitchen table in the dark, the way she made all her real decisions quietly, without ceremony, without waiting for a better option to appear. She went to bed and did not sleep much, and rose before the house and worked by lamplight. She left the kitchen cleaner than she'd found it. She left a note on the table for Hector folded once. She did not labor over it. She wrote what was true and what was useful, and she did not write what was personal, because the personal things had nowhere to go. The station accounts are current through the end of the month. The north pasture fence, third post from the gate, is sinking. On the east side needs resetting before the ground freezes. The flour tin is low. Henderson will have the order ready Thursday if you put it in by Tuesday. She wrote Miles's note separately and went upstairs quietly and slid it under his door. She had been writing it for 3 weeks in her head without knowing she was writing it. One true sentence every day, observed and kept and never spoken, because he had no words yet, and she understood that the right response to someone without words was not to demand them, but to offer your own, as proof that words could be safe. She wrote them all down. He organizes his chalk by color before he begins drawing, always, even when he's in a hurry. He saved the heel of every loaf of bread since the second week, wrapped it in cloth, and put it in his coat pocket. I don't know why, and I didn't ask. He tilts his head to the left when the horses run in the east field, like he's hearing something in it that isn't just sound. He went into the stable. He went in alone, and he stood there, and that was everything, and he didn't need anyone to take him. He is not broken. He never was. He was waiting for someone to learn his language, and he found out he already had one. She stood in the hallway for a moment after sliding it under the door. The house was completely dark. She could hear Miles breathing on the other side of the door, the slow, even breathing of actual sleep. She went downstairs, picked up her bag, picked up Grit's lead. Grit looked at her from the kitchen floor with the expression of a dog who had strong professional objections and was registering them formally. I know, Dot said quietly. Come on. She put her hand on the front door, stood there for a moment with the latch cold under her palm. Then she opened it and walked out and pulled it shut behind her. The road was gray and empty in the pre-dawn dark, the cold sitting on it like a presence, and her boots on the frozen ground made a sound that was too loud in the quiet. She walked toward the gate with her bag over one shoulder and Grit at her heel, and she kept her eyes on the road in front of her, and she did not look back at the house. At the oak tree beside the gate, she stopped. She did not know why she stopped. She put her hand on the bark and stood there and looked back at the dark station, solid and low against the gray sky, the kitchen window lightless, the stable quiet. The place she had made warm for 30 days and was now walking away from in the dark before anyone woke up. She stood there longer than she should have. Then she turned and walked down the road, and the house went behind her, and she did not look back again. She had been sitting under the first stand of cottonwoods a quarter mile from the gate for 20 minutes, bag in the dirt beside her, Grit in her lap, despite being a dog of medium size, with opinions about dignity when she heard boots on the road. Fast at first, then slowing. She did not look up immediately. Dot! She looked up. Hector Brand stood 10 feet away, breathing harder than the distance warranted. His coat unbuttoned, his hat not on straight, and in his hand, a piece of paper she recognized as the drawing from 3 days ago, the one she'd found on the kitchen table that she had looked at carefully and set aside. He was holding it like he'd picked it up in a hurry and not let go of it since. He sat down on the ground beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. She looked at him. He held out the drawing. It was the one of Grit. And in the corner, the hand reaching, and in the opposite corner, small enough that she had seen it and not processed it, 2 words in Miles's careful chalked printing. She stays. He wrote that 2 weeks ago, Hector said. His voice was not steady. He believed that. He put it down as a fact. He paused. And then I went and made him doubt it. She looked at the 2 words. That was me, Hector said. Not Good's letter, not the examiner, me. I heard Harlan's voice in my head, saying when she leaves, and I started pulling back before it happened. I do that. He set the drawing on his knee and looked at it. I have done it with every good thing since Clara. I start managing the ending before it arrives, so that when it comes, I am already somewhere it can't reach me. He stopped. I did it with Miles for 18 months, and I watched him disappear into the silence, and I told myself I was protecting him from more loss, and I was protecting myself. That's the true account. Dot looked at the road. I noticed everything, he said. Every day. The chair he pulled up to the table. The stone on the windowsill. The way he started coming down in the mornings instead of waiting at the edges of rooms. I noticed all of it, and I could see it was you. Every single piece of it was because of you, and instead of saying so, I started putting distance between us, so that when the examiner came and took it apart, I would be somewhere I could survive it. He turned and looked at her directly. That was cowardice dressed up as practicality. I have been a coward about this, and I let you walk out that gate because of it. The cottonwoods moved in the early cold above them. The examiner comes in 6 days, she said. I know. Good's petition is real. Harlan's name is on an official document. I know that too. I am not a doctor, she said. I have no certificate, no training anyone with authority would recognize. I am a miner's widow from Nevada, with 17 cents and a dog, and that is the complete list of what I am in the eyes of a county examiner. Then we show him what Miles is, Hector said. You told me 30 days was enough. You said that 3 weeks ago. He paused. Were you right, or were you telling me what I needed to hear? She looked at him. I was right, she said. Then come back. His voice dropped. I am not asking you to come back for the examiner. I am not asking you to come back for Miles, though God knows he needs you to. I am asking you to come back because that station has been a place people survive in for 18 months, and for the last 30 days it has been a place people live in, and that is entirely because of you. And I was too afraid of losing it to say so while I had it, and I let you walk away instead. Grit shifted in her lap and looked at Hector with one ear forward. You're going to have to do better than this, Dot said. Going forward. I know it. The porch at 5 o'clock. I will be there, he said. Every evening, I will be there first. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Grit, who was already looking at the road back to the station, with the purposeful expression of a dog who had considered the situation fully and reached a verdict. The garden needs covering before the frost, Dot said. I didn't finish it yesterday. She stood up. He picked up her bag without making a point of it, and she let him without making a point of that either, and they started back up the road together. She put her hand on the oak tree's bark as she passed it. He saw her do it, and he did not ask, but she understood from the way he slowed that he had read it correctly. She had been saying goodbye to it that morning. She had stood here and meant to keep walking. He kept pace beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the walking wasn't already saying. They were 50 yards from the gate when the front door opened. Miles stood on the porch in his coat over his nightclothes, bare feet on the cold boards. The journal she had written in his hand pressed against his chest. He had found it before he'd found anything else. He had read it. She could see that he had read it in the way he was standing. Something different in his posture, something that had come through and landed and was still landing. He looked at his father. It was the look of a child who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just found the place to set it down. All of it in that look, the 18 months, the stable, the stone on the table, the drawings on the wall, the sound he had heard his father make in the hallway 3 nights ago. All of it passing between them in the space of a breath. Then Miles looked at Dot. She stopped walking. Beside her, she felt Hector go still. Miles's mouth opened. She saw him work for it, saw the effort of it, the way you saw a man lift something that had been still for a very long time and was heavy with that stillness. His chest moved, his jaw worked once. Then, barely above the threshold of sound, barely a breath made into shape, his voice came out for the first time in 18 months. "Don't go." 2 words. Smaller than a whisper, larger than anything else on that road. Hector's legs went. He dropped to his knees in the dirt in front of his son and put both hands on the boy's face and looked at him the way you looked at someone you had been afraid you'd lost. "Papa hears you," he said. His voice broke clean in half on it. "Papa has always heard you." Miles put his hand against his father's face, slowly, deliberately. His first touch initiated, offered in 18 months. Dot sat down on the bottom step of the porch, because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. She put her face in her hands and held it there. Grit sat at Miles's feet with the settled authority of an animal who had engineered the entire outcome and found it satisfactory. When Dot lifted her face and looked at the sky, she did not trust herself to speak and did not try. She pressed the journal Miles had given back to her against her chest and looked at the high gray Wyoming sky, going pale at the eastern edge, and breathed. Miles reached out and tugged the corner of her sleeve. She looked down at him. He was still beside his father Hector's hand at the back of his neck, but he was looking at her with those serious dark eyes, and in his free hand he was holding out a folded paper. She took it. She opened it. It was the kitchen drawing, the one from the wall, the woman at the stove, and the hand reaching, but he had added to it. On the right side, drawn this morning by the freshness of the chalk, 2 more figures. A man standing in a doorway, and beside the woman at the stove, close but not touching, a small figure with a dog at his feet. All of them in the same kitchen. In the corner, in his careful hand, new words beside the old ones. "She stays. We stay." They went inside together, all 3 of them. Grit last, and the door closed behind them on the cold morning like a period at the end of a sentence that had been running for 18 months. Dot made the biscuits. She did not make a point of it, did not announce the return to routine as a symbolic act. She simply made the biscuits because it was morning and they had not eaten, and biscuits were what the kitchen had the ingredients for. Miles sat at the table and watched her hands, the way he had watched her hands the very first morning, but differently now, with a settled quality rather than a wary one. The watching of someone who has decided the thing in front of them is real and is safe to look at directly. Hector sat across from his son and drank his coffee and said very little, and looked at Miles with the expression of a man who has been handed back something he had convinced himself was gone. After breakfast, Miles went upstairs and came down with his chalk and his papers and sat at the table and drew right there in the kitchen, not in the hallway, not at the edges at the table, while Dot washed the dishes and Hector went over the station accounts at the far end. No one made a remark about it. The ordinary morning moved around them all. At one point, Hector looked up from the ledger and looked at his son drawing and then looked at Dot's back at the basin, and he said nothing, but she heard him set his pen down and pick it up again, and she understood everything in the small sound of it. That afternoon, Miles went to the stable, not part way in, not standing at the door. He walked the full length of the building to Dime's stall and stood in front of it and put his hand through the rail, and Dime put her nose against his palm, and Dot watched from the kitchen window with her hands flat on the sill and did not move for a long time. Hector came and stood beside her at the window, without being invited. He looked at his son with his jaw set and his eyes bright, and he did not speak, and she did not speak. And they watched Miles stand at that stall for the better part of 20 minutes, until Dime shifted and Miles leaned his forehead against the rail. "She used to call Dime her good sense," Hector said. "Said she always rode her when she needed to think clearly, because the horse had better judgment than most people she knew." Dot looked at the side of his face. "Sounds like she was right about most things," she said. "She was," he said, "except she thought I was braver than I am." Dot turned back to the window. Miles had not moved from the rail. "You came down that road at a dead run this morning," she said, "without your hat on straight." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not brave," he said. "That's just a man who figured out what he was about to lose." She looked at him. "Sometimes," she said, Those are the same thing. He looked at her then directly, and neither of them looked away, and the window between them and the stable held the light of the cold afternoon, and Miles stood at the rail with his forehead against the wood, and it was enough, all of it together was enough, and neither of them needed to say so. The county examiner arrived on a Tuesday 6 days later, earlier than expected. His name was Garrett, a lean man in his 50s with a good coat and careful eyes and the professional manner of someone who had learned not to reveal what he was thinking until he had finished thinking it. He arrived in a town buggy with the Caldwell Crossing Council seal on the side panel, which meant Franklin Good had arranged the transportation personally, which told Dot everything she needed to know about the degree to which this assessment was intended to be objective. Hector met him at the gate. She watched from the doorway. Garrett shook Hector's hand and looked at the station with his assessor's eyes taking inventory, without appearing to noting the repaired fence post, the straight crossbar, the water trough no longer listing. The garden covered for winter in neat rows of burlap and straw, the smoke from the kitchen chimney going up clean and straight. He came inside and took off his hat, and Dot offered coffee, and he accepted it and sat at the table with his leather case in front of him, and his hands folded on top of it, and looked at the kitchen. Miles was upstairs. He had been upstairs when the buggy arrived, and Dot had not called him down, and Hector had not gone to get him. They had agreed on this without discussing it. When Miles came down, it would be because Miles decided to come down. "Mrs. Calloway," Garrett said. He had the letter open in front of him. She could see her name on it. "You have been residing at this station for how long now?" 37 days, she said. "And your arrangement with Mr. Brand is as a housekeeper." "A general help," she said. "Cooking, mending, maintenance. I've done the accounts for the last 2 weeks." "And the child?" "And being present in the same house as the child, yes." Garrett looked at her. Dr. Harlan's assessment of the boy's condition characterized it as a profound withdrawal requiring specialized institutional intervention. The petition filed by Councilman Good characterizes your involvement as an unlicensed attempt to treat a medical condition. He paused. "I'm going to ask you to speak plainly to me about what you have actually been doing." Dot set her coffee cup on the table. "I have been cooking meals and keeping a clean house and talking out loud while I work," she said. "I have been leaving things beside drawings left on the kitchen table and not requiring any response. I have been sitting on kitchen floors when loud sounds happen suddenly. I have been present in rooms without making my presence a demand." She looked at him evenly. "If Dr. Harlan considers that a medical intervention requiring a license, I would be very interested in what he considers ordinary human decency." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his letter. "Hector," he said, turning to where Hector stood against the far wall. "The petition states that the boy has shown no meaningful progress, and that continued delay in implementing the facility recommendation constitutes a risk to the child's welfare." "The petition is wrong," Hector said. "On what basis?" Hector reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the table in front of Garrett. The drawing. The kitchen, the woman at the stove, the man in the doorway, the small figure with the dog. "She stays. We stay." Garrett looked at it. "My son drew that," Hector said. 18 days ago. Before that, he had not drawn a person in over a year. Before Mrs. Calloway arrived, he had not sat at this table for a meal voluntarily in 14 months. He had not entered the stable since his mother died. He paused. 6 days ago, he stood at his mother's mare's stall for 20 minutes. He put his hand through the rail. The horse knows him, and she came to him. Hector's voice was level and final. "Dr. Harlan examined my son for 40 minutes on one occasion 14 months ago. I have been his father for 9 years. I know the difference between a child who is unreachable and a child who has not yet been reached." Garrett looked at the drawing for a long time. Footsteps on the stairs. All three of them looked at the kitchen doorway. Miles stood at the bottom of the stairs in his good trousers and his buttoned coat, the one he'd been wearing the day Dot first saw him at the Saturday market, and he walked into the kitchen with the deliberate steadiness of a child who has made a decision and is in the process of honoring it. He looked at Garrett. He looked at his father. He looked at Dot. Then he went to his chair and sat down. Garrett watched him. Miles reached into his coat pocket and set the gray stone on the table. The first stone, the pale one, the one that had traveled from the kitchen table to the windowsill to his father's hand and back again. He set it in the center of the table and put his hands flat beside it and looked at the examiner directly. Garrett looked at the stone, then at the boy, then at Hector, then at Dot. "Mr. Brand," he said. He was looking at Dot, but speaking to Hector. "Is there anything else you'd like me to see?" Hector looked at his son. "Miles, would you show Mr. Garrett your wall?" Miles looked at his father for a moment. Then he pushed back his chair and stood and walked to the stairs and stopped at the bottom and looked back once, waiting. They followed him upstairs. Garrett stood in the doorway of Miles's room for a long time without speaking. His leather case was in his left hand, and he had stopped reaching for anything in it. He walked slowly along the length of the wall, the chalk sequence from Clara's face to the empty bed, to the horses, to the kitchen, with all three of them in it, and he stopped at the last drawing and looked at the two words in the corner and stayed there. "She stays. We stay." Dot stood in the hallway and did not go in. After a while, Garrett turned around. He looked at Miles, who was standing beside his bed with his hands at his sides, and his serious dark eyes watching the examiner with the same direct attention he had given Dot the day she knelt in the market dirt. "Did you draw all of this yourself?" Garrett said. Miles looked at him. Then he nodded. One clear, deliberate nod. Garrett looked at that nod like a man recalibrating something. He looked at Hector. He looked out the doorway at Dot. "I'll be filing my report Thursday," he said. "I don't anticipate you'll find it disagreeable." He went back downstairs and finished his coffee, and picked up his hat and shook Hector's hand, and looked at Dot one more time with an expression she couldn't fully read, except that it was not the expression of a man preparing to remove a child from his home. The buggy went back down the road toward Caldwell Crossing, and Hector stood at the gate watching it go, and Miles stood beside him, and Dot stood at the porch rail, and when the buggy was gone, Hector turned around and looked at her with something in his face she had no name for yet, but that she intended to learn. Garrett's report reached the council 4 days later. The petition was dismissed. She heard about it from Henderson at the general store, who told her in the same businesslike way he'd added the baking powder to her order briefly, without theater, like a fact that had always been headed in this direction. She did not see Miriam Good that day or the day after. She saw her the following Sunday at church. She saw her the moment they walked in, Hector on her left, Miles between them, grit tied at the post outside, because there were limits to what a Wyoming congregation would absorb in a single Sunday. She saw the way the room registered their entrance, the heads that turned, the expressions that moved across faces, the way weather moved across a plain, some uncomfortable, some quietly satisfied, some simply observing. She kept her hands easy and her face even, and walked to the third pew and sat down. The service was the ordinary kind, long on scripture and short on heat from the inadequate stove in the corner, and Miles sat between them and was still in the settled way he had learned to be still, rather than the locked-away way. And twice Hector's knee pressed against hers on the narrow pew in the unconscious way of a man who had stopped monitoring the distance between them, and she did not shift away. After the service, the congregation moved into the thin November cold outside, and the ordinary exchanges of a small town's Sunday carried on around them, and Dot was talking to Ruth Sable, who had driven out from town and was looking at the Brand Station situation with the satisfied expression of a woman whose early confidence had been vindicated when she heard Miles's voice, not loud, not performing, placing. "Your son was unkind to me." 6 words, and the churchyard went as quiet as a churchyard could go with 30 people in it. Miriam Good stood 3 feet from Miles with her reticule in both hands and her expression frozen somewhere between dignity and the abrupt recognition that she had not been prepared for this. Beside her, Everett, Her son, 11 years old, was staring at the frozen ground with something working in his face. Dot did not move. Hector did not move. They stood where they were, and let the words stand exactly where Miles had placed them, in the open air in front of the people who had been in the Saturday market that first morning and knew what they meant. Miriam looked at her son. Everett was not looking at anyone. "Everett," Miriam said. Her voice had lost its carrying quality. Everett looked up. He looked at Miles. Whatever was working in his face had not yet become an apology and had not yet become understanding, but it was somewhere in the territory between them, uncomfortable and real. "I was," Everett said. It came out low. "I was unkind." Miles looked at him for a moment with the serious dark eyes that did not look away from things. Then he nodded. Once, the same clear, deliberate nod he had given the county examiner, received, acknowledged, complete. He turned and looked at Dot, and she looked back at him, and nothing needed to be said, because they had been speaking the same language for long enough, now that words were only one version of it. Miriam Good left without speaking. The churchyard resumed its ordinary Sunday sounds. Ruth Sable put her hand briefly on Dot's arm and said, "That boy," with such complete satisfaction that Dot almost laughed. She almost did. She would get there. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of a place where people had decided to live, rather than simply get through. The station took on the particular warmth of a house where more than one person cared about it, where the repairs got made, not out of grim necessity, but out of the ordinary investment of people who intended to be there tomorrow. Miles's voice came in increments, not steadily, not in a straight upward line, but in the real way of something that had been held a long time and needed to find out what the air felt like before it committed to staying out in it. He spoke to Dot first, always the way he had first drawn at the table when she was the only other person in the room, building from the safe ground outward. Small sentences. Observations. Once standing at Dime's stall with his hand on the mare's neck, he said, "She remembers her." And Dot said, "Yes, I think she does." And neither of them said anything else for a long time. And it was complete. He spoke to Hector the way a boy spoke to a father, when both of them were learning a new dialect of something they had always had, but had stopped using, carefully testing the ground, finding it solid. Hector listened with his full attention, every time, the way a man listened, who knew the cost of being the person in the room who said give it a rest, and who had decided that was the last accounting in that particular ledger. One evening, late in November, Hector came in from the stable and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I need to ask you something." Dot looked up from the mending. He came in and sat at the table across from her, and put his hat on the table and his hands flat on either side of it. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I have not done this before," he said. "Not in the right way. Not starting from the right place." He paused. "I want to do it right this time." She put the mending down. "There is a preacher in Caldwell Crossing," he said. "And there is a county clerk who would have the appropriate paperwork." He looked at her directly. "And there is Miles, who drew 2 figures in a kitchen and wrote, 'We stay,' and I think he was telling both of us something we were taking too long to figure out ourselves." Dot looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to have to say it plainly," she said. "I don't assume." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Almost. "Dot Calloway," he said. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had run down a road without his hat on straight, who had sat down beside her in the dirt under the cottonwoods, who had placed her hands on a saddle cinch and stayed a half-second longer than necessary, and then walked away, and then walked back, who had dropped to his knees in the frost in front of his son, and broken open the way people broke when something they had given up on came back to them. She looked at the gray at his temples, and the set of his jaw, and the hands flat on the table, honest and waiting. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that had been in him for a long time. Upstairs a floorboard shifted. Dot looked at the ceiling, and then at Hector, and he was already looking at the ceiling, and they both looked back at each other, and he said, "He was not asleep." And she said, "He was never asleep." And this time, The corner of his mouth went all the way. They married at the station on a Saturday in early December, just the three of them, and the preacher and Ruth Sable, who had driven out with a jar of her preserved plums, and the expression of a woman who had seen this coming from the second week, and had the patience to wait for everyone else to catch up. Grit sat on the porch rail throughout, with the settled authority of an animal who had arranged the whole affair and considered the outcome well within her projected parameters. Miles stood beside his father at the front of the room, and at the moment the preacher asked if there were any words from the family. Miles looked at Dot with his serious dark eyes, and said clearly in the voice that was still learning what it felt like to take up room in the air. She stayed. Not she stays. She stayed. Past tense. Permanent tense. The tense of something that had already happened and could not be taken back. Dot pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling until she was sure of herself, and then looked back at him and said, "I did." The preacher finished the words, and the thing was done, and Ruth Sable opened her plums, and Grit came inside without anyone's permission, and Miles sat on the floor with the dog in his lap and the chalk in his hand, and drew something quickly on the back of one of the preacher's spare papers, and held it up without being asked. 3 figures. A station, a fence line morning light from the east. And in the corner, in his careful hand, the words he had been building toward since the first morning he sat on the kitchen floor and let a yellow dog rest her chin on his knee. "We are home." The Wyoming winter came in full after that, the serious kind, the kind that tested the work you had done in the fall and told you plainly whether you had prepared or whether you had only intended to. The station held. The fence held. The covered garden held its rows under the burlap and straw. The kitchen was warm in the mornings before anyone else was down, because Dot rose early and lit the stove and started the biscuits and talked to Grit about nothing in particular, while the dark outside the window went blue, and then gray, and then the pale, flat light of a Wyoming December morning came across the high ground from the east. Miles came down first, always earlier and earlier, as the weeks passed, as if sleep had become less important than what was happening in the kitchen. He sat at the table with his chalk and his papers, and drew, and sometimes he described what he was drawing in the offhand way of someone who had so many words available now that a few of them escaped without planning. And Dot said yes, and I see that, and that's her good ear, the one that goes forward when she hears you coming. And he looked up at her with those dark eyes, and almost smiled. Hector came down last the way men came down last in houses where they had learned they were not needed for the morning to begin, but wanted to be present for it anyway. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter and watched his son draw and his wife at the stove, and Grit in the corner, and the winter light coming in at the east window, and whatever he had been carrying for 18 months, he was still carrying, because that was the nature of it. You did not set it down, you learned to carry it differently, and what had changed was that he no longer carried it alone. Some mornings Dot found a drawing on her side of the kitchen shelf. Not on the table, not left anonymously, placed there deliberately in the spot she always set her coffee cup. Always the same subject. A woman at a stove, the braid the particular way of standing. Sometimes Grit at her feet. Sometimes a man in the doorway. Sometimes just her alone. She stays. Written in the corner every time, in the chalk careful hand of a boy who had found his language and discovered to his apparent satisfaction that the people around him had been waiting to learn it. She placed each one in the journal she kept in the kitchen shelf, and the journal grew through December and into the new year, and the pages filled with the evidence of a boy who had never stopped having things to say, and a woman who had been willing to learn how he said them, and a man who had finally understood that the bravest thing available to him was not managing the loss before it arrived, but staying in the room and finding out what remained. Outside the oak at the gate in the hard Wyoming cold, a family lived in a station that smelled like biscuits in the mornings and wood smoke in the evenings, and a yellow dog slept across a boy's feet, and a mare with a thumbprint marking on her nose heard a child's voice in the stable for the first time in 2 years, and lifted her head and came to the rail. Some things once found do not go back to lost. Some people, once home, stay home. And the Brand Relay Station at Caldwell Crossing, Wyoming territory, in the winter of 1883, was the kind of home that knew the difference between a door that opens and a door that holds and held.